Hello all, thank you for joining us for this webinar discussion on what is a patriotic education. I'm Tom Kelly, Vice President of Academic Programs at the Jack Miller Center, an organization committed to education and the principles of the American founding and their place in our history. And with our partners, we at JMC seek to strengthen this foundational civic education in three important ways. We support and empower a growing network of professors who teach the American political tradition. We leverage that network for the benefit of K-12 civics and history teachers, and we convene leaders, practitioners, and funders to build a diverse coalition committed to a true renaissance of civic education in this country. You can learn more about all that we're up to at jackmillercenter.org. I encourage you to check it out, but not right now because we're here to talk about patriotic education. And it's a pleasure to be joined by longtime JMC stalwarts, Professor Stephen Smith and Paul Carrese. Thanks for being with us. It is tax day, so we've chosen an auspicious occasion on which to discuss patriotism. Surely nothing stirs patriotic sentiment quite like committing financial resources to the federal government, state governments. But in fact, Paul, do you want to do your JFK impersonation about what we can do? Not yet. Maybe we'll save that for later. You got to hear Paul's JFK impersonation if you have not. I recommend it. But we're going to talk about patriotic education, what it is, and how our schools and universities should cultivate it. It is increasingly, I believe, the most important question for those of us who care about civic education. It seems to underlie so many of our civic maladies. We have low levels of civic knowledge, but why would you try to understand your country if you don't care about it in the first place? We have a lack of civic participation, but who wants to engage in a political project that isn't worthy or worth celebrating? We have a crisis of military service, but why would you defend your country if you do not love it? Now, this issue of patriotic education recently came to national attention through an executive order of President Trump's, which uses that term specifically. Needless to say, it's been a source of some controversy, and we could just chalk this up to yet another battle in the education wars and move on. But as we approach 2026, when our nation will celebrate its 250th birthday, I think the meaning of patriotic education will come to a head. I don't think we'll be able to avoid it, and so it's well worth our time, particularly for those of us who do civics, to try to come to a better understanding of what we mean by patriotic education. So let's get to it. But first, let me introduce our two wonderful panelists. We have Stephen Smith, who's the Alfred Cowles Professor of Political Science at Yale University. His research and teaching focus on political philosophy, with a special focus on ancients versus moderns, the relationship between religion and politics, and theories of representative government. He's the author of many books, including, most relevant for our purposes, his 2021 book, Reclaiming Patriotism in the Age of Extremes, which I highly recommend. And he's been involved with Jack Miller Center for many years, leading sessions at our highly regarded Miller Fellowship Summer Institute and directing one of our partner programs, the Yale Center for the Study of Representative Institutions. Paul Carrese is the professor and founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. It's one of a number of new departments that are sprouting up at public universities that are committed to civic education. And he's our senior fellow in civic thought and leadership here at Jack Miller Center, so he's spearheading our effort to support that movement in higher education. His research and teaching focus on American constitutional and political thought, civic education, and American grand strategy. And he co-led the national study, Educating for American Democracy, which offers a roadmap for strengthening civics in K-12 schools. And he's writing a book called Teaching America, Reflective Patriotism in School, College, and Culture, which is due out in 2026. And Paul, perhaps we can consider this to be a kind of preview or
that's right. It's a warm-up
for your upcoming book.
This is the warm-up. That's right.
All right. So we'll have a conversation here amongst the three of us for about 45 minutes, but we welcome questions, and we'll try to get to those at the end. We had a couple questions in advance as well, and we'll try to get to all of those. So stick around for questions, and thank you for being with us. But first, I thought we would just define our terms here, and I'd ask you, how you would define patriotism, and how you understand it specifically in the American context. And so, Stephen, why don't we start with you?
Well, first, thanks, Tom, for inviting me on this. And thank you to the Jack Miller Center for doing the kind of work that it does and highlighting civic education as a highest goal and priority. I can't think of anything as educators today that's more important than that purpose. What is patriotism? Good question. I've written a book. I suppose I should have something to say about it. I'll say this. I mean, I'm not offering any especially new or eccentric definition of patriotism. In its basic form, of course, patriotism is love of country. But what does that mean? I'll just put forward this thought. Loving your country, in the sense of American patriotism at least, means understanding our country in the light of its highest ideals, understanding what the best version of ourself is. I'll bring up a name already, Leo Strauss. He once said that it is better to understand the low in the light of the high than the high in the light of the low. Understanding in terms of its aspirations, in terms of its best ideals. We all know that our country, like every country, constantly falls short of these ideals. And yet, if we judge our country simply in terms of our failures, of course, we're in the situation, Tom, that you described earlier. Why should anybody love their country? Why should anybody volunteer for their country? Why should anybody pay taxes for their country if they believe the country is just the worst expression of those things? So it's important that we retain a sense and promote a sense of what we stand for as a people, as a nation, in terms of our highest ideals. And I'm afraid it is that form of patriotism, a lot of which has been lost. We can go on to this later. A lot of which has been lost in some of the current debates about it. I'll leave it at that, just to keep it on the shorter side.
What about you, Paul? How would you define it?
Yes, Stephen's 2021 book, Reclaiming Patriotism, is a marvelous resource. And he eventually emphasizes the term enlightened patriotism as what he wants to defend and explain, and as particularly appropriate to America. So I'll build on that and what Stephen just offered by saying that Tocqueville is a very helpful resource here in Democracy in America when he visits in the early 1830s, because he observes that there's a traditional meaning of patriotism really from the old world, which is emphatically sentimental, or it's about emotion, love, as Stephen just mentioned, love of country. But in America, there's both that element and a new rational element, because in this new world, as Tocqueville says, politics features ideas. He doesn't mention the Declaration of Independence by name there, but we could think that that's what he probably has in mind, right? The highest ideals or aspirations that Stephen just mentioned too are captured in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence, which is about argument and reasons and prudence and judgment and law. So Tocqueville says the Americans have a new world patriotism that is a reflective patriotism, or it could be called a considered patriotism. And Stephen in his book uses enlightened patriotism. So that's what patriotism, I think, at its core meaning and its best meaning says about an American patriotism. It's this blend of the rational with the sentimental, and gratitude and appreciation.
So is that unique in the American context, this combination of the rational and the emotional?
Stephen, go.
What do you think?
I think it is to a very large degree, for just some of the reasons Paul was just saying. For the most, throughout much of its history, patriotism was often, more or less identified with what we might call blood and soil, or land and soil, something like that. It was a kind of ethnic patriotism, homeland patriotism. And of course, it's never entirely separate from those considerations. But I do think what distinguishes American patriotism is this, I call it idealist element, or rationalist, reflective element, that brings ideals and reasons as well as sentiments and attachments together. What I call in my book once ethos patriotism and logos, in a way, ethos, and to use these Aristotelian terms, ours is a patriotism where both ethos and logos, both habits, customs, traditions, as well as reasons, reflection, and rationality, sort of work in tandem.
So I think, so there are these dual parts of patriotism, logos and ethos, the rational, the emotional. And when there are two facets to something, there's often this tendency to focus on one over the other, or to lose one in light of the other. And in the American context, it's particularly, I think we sometimes have a harder time with understanding the emotional, or the sort of pre-Enlightenment, pre-rational aspect of American patriotism. The Jack Miller Center for America's Founding Principles, that alone suggests that we're focused in particular on the rational, the rational side of patriotism, the enlightened or reflective aspect of patriotism. But I'm interested, so I'm interested about the ethos side. We can talk about education on the logo side, but let's start with the ethos side. What role does education play, in your opinion, or maybe none at all, in cultivating the ethos of American patriotism?
Well, the educational project can be defined in narrower terms as formal schooling. And in the United States, from the time of the founding, a discussion about at least publicly supported schools. They're often church schools, but publicly supported schools. And then with Horace Mann, the public school movement, and that's what most of us are familiar now with, right? State, in some way or other, state-sponsored public schools, and then private schools, some of which are religious, colleges and universities, right? So formal schooling. But again, a figure like Tocqueville is very helpful. And here he's, echoing his great French predecessor Montesquieu, that culture is itself educating. And so all kinds of sources of education about the meaning of America and gratitude for and love of America come from civil society and associations of civil society and civic ritual and civic practices, some of which then are ratified by the government in a certain sense, right? We have a national anthem, America the Beautiful. We have a flag. We've had a flag since the 1770s in the Revolutionary War. We have a Pledge of Allegiance. So some of those are sort of state-sponsored and official and national holidays, like July 4th. But they're also just elements of civic culture. The ritual of the national anthem and in sports games, right? That's not sanctioned by the government per se. I mean, the Pledge of Allegiance falls in a sort of middle, right? The Pledge of Allegiance is quasi-governmental in a way if it's done in schools. And then we can get, later, that Tocqueville emphasizes the religious culture in America. And Stephen does this a bit in his book, right? That love of country is related to faith in and hope about country. And that comes definitely in the American context from the civil society culture side, not from the government, because of the principle we have of separation of church and state. So, America is like a good or bad dating relationship. You say, well, it's complicated, right? It's complex. It's always more than one element and more than one principle here, with these civil society, cultural, civic ritual, and religious elements, along with the rational and so formal schooling elements.
Right. So, so the pledge has, Steve, go ahead, Stephen.
No, I'm just going to agree very much with what Paul said. The importance of civic rituals. I was going to mention Pledge of Allegiance in schools. I must admit I don't know much about K through 12 education, and it probably varies from place to place. I don't know to what degree kids say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore.
Still widely done.
Still widely done, okay, but not done everywhere. Anyway, but that's certainly one way, but also a kind of ethos of service and trying to connect education with service to the country. I'll just tell one story briefly, which I tell in my book, which was, I think, connected to this, and which was in some ways one of the inspirations for the book. The 4th of July, something that all Americans, left and right, all celebrate. You may understand it differently, but I was at this is now quite a number of years ago. I was at a 4th of July party at the home of one of my colleagues, and about 10 people there. And there was a reading. We did a reading of the Declaration of Independence before we all, tucked into our hamburgers and hot dogs. And the hostess of the party of the evening said, "How many of you grew up in a home that flew an American flag?" None of us had. She had. We hadn't. I didn't. And there was a distinct embarrassment about this. There seemed to be something a little bit like she had touched on an issue that made people uncomfortable in a way. Not exactly sure why it had. Maybe they weren't sure exactly. But it was at that moment that I began to think, here we are celebrating our national holiday. It's not that you have to go around flying the flag and making a big deal out of it, but why did the question itself seem to make people uneasy, and it's palpably uneasy? And it was that reluctance to think about, to endorse what it was we were doing fully, that made me begin to think more about what patriotism, why patriotism can't simply be assumed any longer. Maybe a book like this would not have been necessary a number of years ago, but I think today more than ever, many people are queasy with the idea of patriotism. And of course, it has been misused as well by many people. So it was my own effort to try, at least for my purposes, to gain clarity on what this term meant and how it was related to these issues that you put, Tom, about the ethic of patriotism, the ethic of service, love of country, and other things of that nature.
There is significant discomfort around the idea of patriotism. One of our questioners in a question ahead of time described it as toxic. I don't know if it's that far, but there's definitely a discomfort. There was a study by the American Historical Association asking middle and high school teachers about the purposes of their U.S. history courses, and only 50% of teachers responded that instilling civic pride in their nation was an important or very important goal of a U.S. history course, whereas 83% said that building an appreciation for diversity was an important or very important goal. So, ambivalent on the matter of civic pride, but clear consensus when it comes to something like diversity. So, Paul, do you want to say more? Why is that the case? Why is there this discomfort around the idea of patriotism? And is it tied to the ethos element in particular?
Well, I would say this reflects the history of education in America and the change in higher education, colleges and universities. And so I'll simplify this grossly by saying up until the period of the Cold War, there was a predominant view in K-12 schools and public schools that patriotism was a part of the responsibility of civics and history, and then the term social studies arose. But in the 1950s, the National Education Association, which was then and still is now the largest teachers union, published a guidebook on citizenship education, which emphasizes love of country, blended in the American way. They don't cite Tocqueville, blended the American way with knowledge, study, debate, disagreement, free speech, dissent, all these, all fitting with consecration of the citizens in the public schools to the country and love of country. They put all of that together. That's the NEA did that. Well, that is not where the NEA is at now. And that's partly because higher education shifted. So another person in the story here is John Dewey. And the idea from the 1920s onward, Dewey's philosophy of education about democracy. And you're not really citizens of America per se. America stands not for the founding and not for, civic rituals and such. It stands for the idea of democracy, which means we invent it in every generation. We are self-governing. And so, for example, Stephen Smith and I have been members, or at least I'm still a member, of the American Political Science Association. I've been a member since I was a doctoral student 30 plus years ago. The language coming out of the APSA, representing this new view in higher education, uses the word civic in relation to engagement or civic participation or civic agency. They rarely had used the term for 30 plus years civic education, and certainly not the word patriotism, right? So the K-12 schools reflect what higher education has done. And in higher education, political science, history, philosophy, these various disciplines just are very uncomfortable with the idea of patriotism and of civic or citizenship education in anything like the traditional way. And their emphasis is on critique of America as they critique everything. But also, if they talk about the civic at all, it is the civic participation, civic engagement, civic agency, that sort of talk. So that's what goes down into the K-12 schools. And then, of course, the K-12 teachers, by what they omit on the one hand and what they emphasize on the other, very deeply shapes the sense of civic identity, civic attachment, patriotism in younger generations.
So specifically in that ethos element, is there anything more than, say, the Pledge of Allegiance that you think that at the K-12 level that schools should be doing to cultivate character, habits, or sentiments, patriotic sentiments? Or do you think that just doesn't make sense for given where we are in terms of the dividedness of the country or things like? What do you think about that? Is there a role for education, particularly on that aspect?
Stephen?
Well, I'm sure there is. I don't think saying the Pledge of Allegiance, I mean, I think it's a start. It doesn't, if students, if I was any example, most are yawning, and it doesn't mean that much. It doesn't mean that much, frankly. It's a morning ritual that you go through at the beginning of class. And like every ritual, it becomes habituated and becomes very rather just rote. So it's a useful reminder. But I think I don't have I wish I had a better answer to that question. What else should public schools be doing, or elementary or high schools be doing? I mean, right, the lack of civic knowledge and the importance of returning some kind of basic political or civic literacy in history classes, or even in literature, or in literature classes. I mean, one of the points I try to make in my book is that I don't want to emphasize just patriotism has to be about understanding the founding principles, the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists and the Declaration, as important as they are. But in many ways, those principles are expressed in our literature, in our religious life. And I think particularly the way literature is taught could easily be an important venue for the way in which a kind of civic pride can be encouraged. And to give students a sense, kind of piggybacking on what Paul said here, that civic doesn't mean simply teaching people that it's patriotic to protest. We hear that all the time. You see it on bumper stickers. Protest is patriotic. I see that sometimes. Yes, it can be. I'm not against protest as such. Certain protests I don't like, but that's in the American tradition. But that's certainly not the only form of protest. And teaching students to honor things, to honor important figures in our tradition. I think that is what students, younger students particularly, they want to know lives, they want to know biographies. Teaching who our great civic leaders were, whether it's George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or many, many others, giving them a sense of the idea of what American lives are at their best. And that, I don't know, I think that would be very useful as a way of introducing students, not just high school students, but all students, college as well, to a kind of civic and patriotic education.
So what about that logo side? That's sort of maybe a more natural fit for schools, or an easier fit that can fit specifically in the curriculum. You know, Paul, what's
Yes,
the
I'll
way to
address that,
educate
but
for
also
Go ahead.
the blend here and K-12. So you mentioned earlier the Educating for American Democracy report. I was one of 7 co-authors, and we agreed to use the term reflective patriotism in our guidelines. It's not a national curriculum. It's guidelines that public schools, districts, states can use to assess how adequate their civics and history education is, the curriculum and state standards and things. Reflective patriotism is a crucial term we settled on, Tocqueville's term, and we cite Tocqueville in the report. And that's one of 3 civic virtues that we emphasize. And they are civil disagreement, civic friendship, and reflective patriotism. In a way, they fit together. Civic friendship across partisan and philosophical views. We're Americans in this together as citizens or aspiring citizens. Civil disagreement fits with civic friendship, that I think Stephen is wrong about something, and it could be a very important moral question, right? I mean, obviously slavery, right? Or women's rights and women's voting, but all kinds of policy issues. Well, if I think Stephen's wrong, I don't think he's evil and un-American. If we disagree about that, we would argue back and forth in a civil way. So, and then the third is reflective patriotism, and I think it undergirds the other 2 in a way, to have the commitment to America, gratitude about America, love and loyalty that is blended and balanced with the rational element. There's got to be knowledge, right? And that's the basis for the civic friendship, which is a difficult thing, and the civil disagreement, which is a difficult thing. And how do you do that? So we use the terms civic knowledge and civic virtues in the EAD report. And then by grade band, K through 2, there are appropriate ways to get across the right fundamental civic knowledge in history and constitutional civic knowledge, and blending with these civic virtues, and then in 3.5 and in 6.8 and in 9.12. So the blending of the 2, and we also mentioned in the report that while this is about K-12, none of this will ever really be embodied in K-12 unless it's happening in higher education as well. So Stephen's book, to have professors of political science, of history, of philosophy, of classics, talking about citizenship education as part of their coursework and their research. This used to happen all the time in literature as well, as Stephen just mentioned, right? I took a wonderful course at Middlebury College as an undergraduate in American literature on the theme of the American epic, right? That America is a kind of hero in various works, democracy in various works of literature, right? Moby Dick and Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, and we could go on. So this used to happen, and it does not happen in most colleges, universities. Stephen is the exception that proves the rule. I mean, he's not the only one, but it's rare. So, and I'll just flash one example. In our little department of Civic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, we have a pocket constitution, but it's appropriate to higher education. It's a Socratic pocket constitution, right? The Declaration, the Constitution with all the amendments, Gettysburg Address, 1863, calling for a new birth of freedom. Then 1963, Martin Luther King. And as Stephen has already mentioned, you could add to this, right? Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Seneca Falls Declaration, and Susan B. Anthony. You could add, right? And then it would be too thick. But this is what a higher education should do. And if the teachers get that kind of a Socratic, reflective civic education in their formal schooling in undergraduate studies, but also the school board members and the parents and everybody else in the school, then there's a chance for the K-12 teachers, who are the civics and history, social studies experts, to bring some of this reflective patriotism, blending the loyalty and love with the civic knowledge and the civic virtues, actually achieve that in K-12 schools.
Yeah, so doing the knowledge side right, or doing that rational component right, allows you to do the ethos side And if you don't do the first part right, it's very hard to do that second part. It seemed.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen beautifully captures this in the book by saying to be an American and have an American sense of patriotism means you are entering an argument. That's why right. We wanted to just capture this is an argument that goes across 2-3 centuries, right? And we could add other things to it. And it's difficult to hold that intention. These are people who love America and are grateful for America, but America is also about ideas, and we're going to argue about it. And there's some very important arguments to have, obviously, throughout our history and still today.
And Stephen, I'll quote one line from your book just because it's like the mission of the Jack Miller Center, basically, which you write that patriotism can only be taught through a long and deep engagement with the founding texts of our political tradition. So can you just say a little bit more about what you meant there?
Well, as Lincoln once said about something, I meant everything I said and nothing I did not say. No, I think that's very important to me. I think I'm not sure that that's necessarily something that would be started in earlier levels. I mean, you could probably introduce high school students to some of the founding documents, maybe some Federalist Papers or the Declaration, certainly. But no, ours is going back to the beginning in many ways. We're a country based on principles and ideas, and those ideas are usually expressed in books. How do we access them? They're books and texts and essays and articles, unusually so, I believe. And a deep engagement with those is I think, very important, is fostering it is patriotism. I want to just say one thing. Paul used a term which I use in my book too, but I think is important to highlight. He talked about gratitude. It's hard to know exactly how do you instill a sense of gratitude in people. I mean, we know people who seem to just naturally have a sense of gratitude for what they received in life, their families, their situation, and others are resentful, and it's hard to know if those are innate dispositions or whether they can be cultivated in some sense. But patriotism is certainly connected with a sense of gratitude. We've received something of value from our country that we cherish, and that we could not think of ourselves without being a part of. And to just speak to why it is that you're one of the callers described patriotism as toxic, which I think it is in some quarters, to be sure. People have been brought up to believe falsely that patriotism simply means my country, right or wrong, or my country's better than your country, or it's somehow connected with an unreflective endorsement of whatever your country is or whatever you think it is, or whether it has to do with some kind of sense of superiority to others. And that seems to me destructive of the spirit of gratitude, of loyalty, of ethos that I value, and I think is certainly embedded in what Paul described as the program's conception of reflective patriotism. Because one thing that Tocqueville very much emphasized, which I loved very much about is the way in which, for him, reflection and thought and emotion and sentiment are not opposites, that they psychologically work together to support one another. So to speak of a reflective patriotism doesn't necessarily mean that we focus only on high ideas and so on, but it means that these aspects of service and symbolism and other forms of the ethic of patriotism can come to the support and must come to the support of the ideals we express.
But some of that discomfort around things like gratitude, and in your book, Stephen, you mentioned faith and devotion, which we often talk about when we're talking in patriotic terms. We often talk in those terms, and they seem to have vague connections to religion. We hear about civil religion, and at the National Summit on Civic Education that Jack Miller Center did in November, Jane Kamensky was on one of our panels. She's the president of Monticello. And she said one of the reasons the civics left the classroom in the 1960s was that it seemed too close to religion. As religion was evacuating the classroom, patriotism went with it. Do you think that that's true, that there's something like sort of the vague religious quality that we sometimes talk about patriotism, or that sometimes comes up with patriotism? Is that part of where we run into trouble in talking about patriotic education, either at the K-12 or at the higher ed level?
Maybe. I don't think that patriotism is specifically a religious sentiment, although religion can obviously be used to support it or to sustain it. It can also be used to oppose it as well in some respects. But I do think what the two share in a way, patriotism is in religion, and maybe this contributes to the discomfort that you just described, Tom, is that both propose, in many ways, ideals to look up to. It suggests something superior in a way, something above us, something to which we can only aspire. And to some, maybe that's kind of a denial of our freedom, denial of our autonomy. It makes us seem, in many ways, passive, possibly, I don't know. But this idea, it seems to be reject the idea that there is something that, something to which we can aspire, and that is important to both religion and patriotism.
It's very American. It's very American to be both aware of and committed to the metaphysical, let's say, the spiritual, the religious, and to be concerned about it, right? This happens from the time of the founding, and to be concerned about it from the stance of reason and enlightenment. And this goes throughout our history up to the present. You capture just in Lincoln, right? Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, it captures 25 years of his public argument. It's about the founding, it's about the Declaration, it's about the arguments, about the reasons, the justice, and then his second inaugural, which has no mention of the founding and of reason and of the Declaration. And it's biblical. How to make sense of the horror we just inflicted on each other, and how do we heal from this point? How do we move forward? So that's a wonderful way of capturing America, is all of that complexity. What has shifted, again, is that American higher education in the 20th century fully adopted what had begun in the 19th century, the research university model, John Dewey, a reflection of that, the rationalism. And again, it's there from the founding. The Declaration has 4 references to a divinity, and then it closes with sacred honor, right? Only one of those references to a divinity was in Jefferson's draft, and well, 1.5. The sacred honor was there as well, right? The concern that Tocqueville has in Democracy in America with rationalism and a kind of materialism and a kind of individualism, he can see that in the 1830s, right? America's a modern country. So I think what has happened let's just pick from the midpoint of the 20th century onward, American higher education emphasized, even in the disciplines that used to be able to talk about the metaphysical and the spiritual and the religious and these dimensions of the American experience, they just don't do it. They stop doing it, or it's only in a critical way. So we've lost that balance in higher education, and that has been part of I think, the undermining of a reasonable and also patriotic civic education that could come from higher education, and support K-12 civic education.
Right. Okay. Slight change of gears here. You mentioned patriotism at the time of the founding. I'm curious, Stephen. You talk some in your book about how our founders understood patriotism. So I wonder if you could say some about their understanding, and maybe how it's consistent with the way you're presenting civic education or patriotic education. Maybe there are some differences too, but Go ahead.
Right. Well, they certainly thought of patriotism. I mean, just to take one obvious point, which seems funny to us today in a way, maybe it seemed funny to them, how they were able to appropriate the term during the revolutionary period, at least. They appropriated the term patriots for themselves, who were breaking away. The loyalists were the ones who were, you could say they were the actual patriots. They wanted to remain part of Britain, but patriot, maybe this goes back to our connection in a certain way between patriotism and protest, patriotism and rebellion, because our patriotism begins oddly with an act of rebellion and an act of resistance, and that has been with us ever since, for in many ways both good and bad purposes. It can lead to a kind of sense of ungovernability at some level, but it's also a kind of honorable sense of resistance. Martin Luther King, civil rights, abolition, these are very much part of the American patriotic tradition. So I would say what was unique, going back, Tom, to your original question about what is patriotism and is there any distinction, or what is different about American patriotism, goes back precisely to this founding moment when patriotism becomes the term of the revolutionaries and of the rebels. And I think that that act itself is something that has been in many ways built into the DNA of America and the DNA of American patriotism ever since.
Yeah, it is a fascinating thing. We're in the America 250 commemorations already, right? It's 250 years ago that Lexington and Concord happened, and Washington is not the only one to use this word patriot about the American cause, but it does capture this theme in Stephen's book, what we've been talking about. The Declaration of Independence says that it's the king and parliament who have violated justice and violated the common law and the principles of common law. So we, the Americans, are patriotic to the true principles of justice and the constitutionalism that we thought we shared with the king and parliament in London, but they are violating that constitutionalism. So it's this, Martin Luther King's civil disobedience, right? It's not lawlessness. It's I'm breaking the law because it's an unjust law according to these higher principles, and then I accept my punishment. So this is all see how fascinating civic education could be. I mean, there are all these things that we could be talking about over the next 15 years, from the commemorating the Declaration of Independence to commemorating the ratification of the Bill of Rights.
And it's extraordinary why, Paul, why has American educators given up on this? Right, this is a rich vein of human history and reflection. It's such a crime that it's no longer reflected in the same way in our high school and college curriculum.
Yeah. There is a wave of interest in this now. I mean, Stephen's book in 2021, same year, Ronald Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins, about higher education having dropped the ball, right? What universities owe democracy is he and his co-authors, their way of framing it. But Richard Haas's book from just a couple of years ago, 2023, Richard Haas, criticized for the longest time as being, swamp creature, establishment, Washington, D.C. He's on MSNBC regularly. Here's this very patriotic book, The Bill of Obligations, right? To mirror the 10 rights in the Bill of Rights, we need 10 obligations, habits of good citizenship. And loyalty, the number 9 is support civic education. And number 10 is loyalty to country. Put country before party and partisanship and yourself. I mean, this is from Richard Haas, So and then another great book that's come out since Stephen's book, Brooke Manville and Josiah Ober, Josh Ober at Stanford University, very important now in the higher education civics Renaissance, their book, The Civic Bargain, right? Sort of comparative study of what worked and didn't work in Athens and the Roman Republic, and then the beginnings of sort of constitutional monarchy and republicanism in Britain, and then the American case study. But they're very interested in the idea of civic education. It's one of their essential qualities, and referring to civic virtues. And so there is a kind of renaissance and renewal happening, and all of them sharing this idea that this should not be partisan. That we need to pull out of the polarization and the extremes. There are differences of principle and differences of opinion, and that's very important. But there's no reason to be so extreme and polarized in the way we either totally repudiate civic education and patriotism, or we have very narrow exclusionary views of what it should mean.
One of those terms that's often a flashpoint is the idea of American exceptionalism, and I wonder if either of you could, jump in on how you understand this idea of exceptionalism. I think we've touched on a little bit, but and whether you think it's something that we should, promote in our educational systems. And I encourage listeners to submit questions. We'll try to get those in our remaining time. But the idea of American exceptionalism, who wants to take it?
You want me to go?
Go ahead, Stephen.
My book, written in 2021, endorses this idea of it. I discuss it and I endorse my version of American exceptionalism. And just to bring the question up to the current moment, we are beginning to look less and less like an exceptional country at the moment. We are behaving more like, you might say, a 19th century great power trying to carve out spheres of influence and to, I think American exceptionalism is in for a rocky ride for the next few years. What we're seeing more and more is the rise, I don't know that this term is used, but the narrative seems to be coming down a more of a stab in the back theory, that America is the victim of disloyal elites, of foreign allies who are free riding on us, who deserve only to be imprisoned or whatever. I think it's important to renew our sense of what's exceptional in America. But I think the term itself at the moment is going to be much more difficult to defend when we are not acting in a way as we were for many years, the leader of the free world, a term that I don't hear much any longer, the leader of the West at a time when Europe itself is being despised and being repudiated. And it's very hard to say at the moment what is exceptional in America. I think we still are, but I think that's going to be a much more difficult case to make.
But to the extent that we are, what is it that makes us exceptional, Stephen?
Well, I think we've been talking about that in many ways. It's been behind this, the aspirational character of who we are and what we might become. A country in which the immigrant, the newcomer, as Lincoln talked about, is as welcome as those who have been here. The idea that all are invited to participate at the table. I mean, this is an extraordinary moral achievement in human history, unlike any other kind of society that has existed before. It's not just my homeland that determines it, but the person who comes from hillbilly elegy country is as much as an American as someone like myself who comes from the south side of Chicago, or people who come more recently from other parts of the world. These are all Americans, and that is the genius of American exceptionalism, which I fear is very much in danger of being lost.
Paul, what do you
A few
think?
points here, Tom. The Declaration of Independence captures this in that it is about obviously a people, right? This is an Anglo-American people. The bulk of the Declaration is here as the king and the parliament, how they have violated. And they use the phrase in the middle of it, they have violated our Constitution, right? Which was the shared Constitution, right? So it's about a people, but it's also obviously universal. That captures American exceptionalism. The principles of the Declaration are for everybody. Let facts be submitted to a candid world, right? And it's also a place and a history. So, but then a second point, right? Abraham Lincoln is also a great resource here. In 1838, probably his first real public address that we have on record, 1838, the Young Men's Lyceum, itself a civil society, kind of civic education association in Springfield, Illinois, gives this extraordinary address on the perpetuation of our political institutions. And he's very worried about the angry populism. He's just, the Jackson era, the first Donald Trump, Andrew Jackson has just been in the White House, kind of angry populism and a lawlessness, sort of the worst elements of democracy, small d, coming out and about charged moral issues, slavery, but gambling and religious differences and alcohol, etc. And Lincoln's remedy is civic education. And it has a cold, rational element to it and an emotional element, right? We must impart in the schools and in families and in society study of, but also reverence for the laws and the Constitution. And then other ways of emotional attachment to America as well. And I think we've got an angry populism in American culture that, obviously President Trump embodies that, but he's not the only one that embodies that. And that I think we should take a page from Abraham Lincoln in 1838. That makes America less than what it should be. Our kind of exceptionalism is not this angry exclusionary exceptionalism. It's better than that. It's higher than that.
Okay, we'll get to a few questions that we've received, and we've kind of touched on some of these, but one of the first is about the issue of indoctrination. How do we, just succinctly, how do we avoid indoctrination when it comes to patriotic education? Paul or Stephen, who wants to jump in?
Jump in with the Educating for American Democracy report, which again we thought should capture the spirit of citizenship education and higher education as well. The EAD report again uses civic knowledge and civic virtues, but the main approach that we recommend to states, localities, as they think about assessing and revising their civics and history curriculum is to think of the content in terms of important ideas and texts and leaders and moments, and then get students thinking in terms of questions and disagreement, right? There's fundamental knowledge to know, but then the knowledge, of course, is itself giving rise to arguments and disagreements, right? And to understand the Declaration is to understand the argument that the Americans have with themselves in two continental congresses and in various kinds of writing. What should we do? And then eventually we should declare independence, but that's an argument. And then the Constitution obviously arises out of argument and this extraordinary ratification debate. So here's, Stephen and I both in a way descend from a scholar named Herbert Storing at the University of Chicago. I was taught by people who studied with Storing directly. But one extraordinary thing that Herbert Storing did to put an emphasis on knowledge by political scientists, historians, others of the anti-federalist argument against ratification of the Constitution as it was. And Storing in this introduction to this extraordinary set of volumes, getting the best of the anti-federalist writings, Storing, speaking for himself, says, I think the Federalists had the better of the argument. Storing saying, I would have voted for ratification. But you cannot know that unless you know the anti-federalist writings at their best. And also the anti-federalist ideas have percolated, right? So an American citizenship education is connected to a liberal arts education because that's what it was from the founding. That's where we're about the Declaration and the Constitution itself. Reason, argument, evidence, disagreement, civil disagreement, that is the American way to understand America and to be patriotic about America.
Thank you. A couple of questions we have from Ben Gross and Greg Rose ask about, and I'm going to kind of summarize here, but they ask about whether education can accomplish all that we're asking it in light of kind of hyper-individualism that we experienced in the decline of civic associations that used to sustain patriotic education in schools. Stephen, do you want to answer?
Well, the obvious answer is no. I mean, education can't do everything. Paul and I are teachers, so we're naturally prone to have a bias in favor of education. But education also means knowing something about the limits of what we can teach. And it always sort of amuses me when I hear people talking about what students are getting from their teachers and what they're being taught. It kind of assumes that like students are just these empty vessels that we're filling with our opinions. I often wish that were the case. How much of what any of us say in a classroom really sticks is something very hard to know, and it's a humbling thought, and probably one that you don't want to be thinking about all the time. But it does make a difference. But education is part of a broader national culture. We have to be aware, and we're only a part of that. How much a part? We compete with other institutions. We compete with big drivers of economic change and so on. So I think education is important, to be sure, maybe even fundamental, but it obviously can't do all the work unless these are sustained by other branches of civil society, whether these are, again, go back to religion, could be churches, synagogues, mosques, could be instrumental and important in this, as well as family discussions around the table. I mean, we talked about a moment ago, can or should religion play a part in patriotism? This is the holiday time of Passover. We were at a Seder Saturday night, and, we told the story of the Exodus, of freedom, bondage, liberation, emancipation. And of course, we talked about this in terms of events and current events too. So this seems to, and there were, and believe me, there were many different opinions on the table. I mean, it was a good example of the kind of debate that Paul was talking about earlier, from those on the left and the right. And yet at the end of the evening, we all joined and affirmed who we were. And to me, I can't think of anything kind of more patriotic than that sense.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, well, just quickly to respond, the book that I'm working on, Teaching America, as the subtitle, Reflective Patriotism in Schools, College, and Culture. So K-12 schools could do a better job of gaining partnerships in their local communities, civil society, institutions, and associations. And I think could do a better job. I think higher education could do a better job of thinking about civic culture. I'll give one of my favorite examples. 50 years ago, just before the bicentennial celebration in the 1970s, Ray Charles issued his new version of America the Beautiful. And he chooses to begin with what was the third verse that Catherine Lee Bates wrote. So here's this descendant of slaves in America, puts the third verse up in front about the sacrifice of basically white people, mostly, dying in the Civil War to put an end to slavery, right? That's beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, right? So that's a civic culture moment. It's immensely complicated to work through what is going on here, right? And what does this mean? And then the traditional version, the first verse, oh beautiful for spacious skies, etc. So all these ways in which civic culture can capture this reflective, patriotic blend and balance of the ethos and the logos.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm afraid we have to end on that note. I think we've only scratched the surface, but I would encourage everyone to, if you want to continue the conversation with Stephen, even if you can't talk to him directly, I highly recommend his book, and look out for Paul Carrese's book coming out next year. And check out, the Jack Miller Center site and sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to learn more about upcoming webinars and the ways that Jack Miller Center is supporting patriotic education. Special thanks to our donors for making this program possible. If you'd like to support Jack Miller Center, you can do that on our website at jackmillercenter.org. Happy Tax Day to everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Stephen.
Great to see both of you, Paul and Tom, and thanks everyone to JMC.
Thank you.